As you know, some of us think that the 3 buildings at the World Trade Center, buildings 1, 2, and 3, were brought down through a process of controlled demolition. So the question naturally arises, if that's the case, that seemingly outlandish thing, if that's the case, surely somebody on the scene would have noticed something, especially if this is, in any sense, a standard controlled demolition which uses explosives. Surely somebody would have heard them, or seen them, or felt them. And the answer, of course, is they did. And my job today is to give a brief overview of some of the eyewitness statements. I say some because my collection is far from comprehensive, but it should give you a pretty good taste of what this literature, as well as some of the video footage, looks like. 3 points I want to make today. First, the conviction that the towers came down because of explosions, as opposed to structural failure, was common on 9/11. Secondly, there is substantial eyewitness evidence supporting this conviction. And third, this eyewitness evidence has been ignored or suppressed by the 9/11 Commission and the National Institute of Standards and Technology. We begin then with the conviction that the towers came down because of explosions was common. Now, why is this even important? It took me a few years to realize how important this simple point really is. And I'll try and explain to you. It seems to me there's a very common presupposition, occasionally voiced, but often unvoiced. And it is this, that on 9/11 everybody, especially those on the scene, knew that the towers came down because they were hit by airplanes. And the airplanes obviously damaged them. And the fires subsequently damaged them. And through some kind of structural failure, which usually people don't want to get into in detail, they came down and it was obvious. And that was the story, and that was the perception, and that was the belief. And that people who suggest controlled demolition brought them down are latecomers. They're revisionists. They're people who came along later with their cockeyed theory. And they perhaps have some special conspiratorial way of thinking, which leads them to unnecessarily complicate a simple situation. The idea that these buildings came down because of explosions, and even, more specifically, because of explosives planted in the building, was an idea found all over the place on 9/11. On the scene by eyewitnesses, even on television, on the radio, in the paper. Very common. And it's important that we know that. It changes our perspective on this. So here's my first video. The reporter here is N.J. Burkett, and he's working for ABC News 7, and he's standing very near the towers.
Take 2. Take 2 and 2, 1.
This is as close as we can get to the base of the World Trade Center. You can see the firemen assembled here, the police officers, FBI agents. The towers, a huge explosion now raining debris on all of us.
So this man had to pick up, he and his companion had to pick up the camera and run for their lives. And I don't see any evidence that Mr. Burkett had a particular conspiratorial frame of mind. And he certainly didn't come around after the event. This is his spontaneous judgment, standing in a place of great danger. He says, before the material even hits the ground, a huge explosion now, raining debris on all of us. We better get out of the way. And he runs. And just so you know, he also had to run for his life when the North Tower came down a little bit later. And he described that as a blast. So here we have some people who are off screen in, I assume, their apartment or condo in New York City, watching and filming, in this case, the North Tower in the distance, and we can hear them talking in the background. And it's particularly the man who talks here that I want you to listen to. I assume it's Matthew Shapoff.
Walking and I had my shoes on and I was about to go out the door, I would have been walking around when this happened. Oh my God! That was a bomb that did that.
Oh God, look at that!
That was a fucking bomb that did that. There's no goddamn way that could have happened.
God.
Again, this gentleman didn't come along after the scene. He made his judgment as the North Tower came down, and he made it just as the debris was beginning to hit the ground. That was a bomb that did that, he said. Now, by the way, I just want to remind you what I'm trying to prove here. I'm not using Shapoff's evidence to argue that controlled demolition took place. I'm not even at that stage of the talk yet. I'm simply making a historic point about history, that there were people on that day who made the spontaneous judgment that these buildings exploded. My next example is from firefighter Christopher Fenyo, and this is taken from the FDNY oral histories. And he's talking about a period after the South Tower came down, that was the first tower to come down, and before the North Tower came down. So sometime roughly between 10 and 10:30 in the morning, it turns out there was a debate happening among firefighters at the scene. Quote, "At that point, a debate began to rage because the perception was that the building looked like it had been taken out with charges." In other words, not merely that it came down because of explosions in some general sense, but that the building had been rigged for demolition. They were debating that before 10:30 in the morning on 9/11. And that's the debate that is still raging 10 years later. The debate between some kind of structural collapse hypothesis and the explosion hypothesis. Pent bomb, as Barbara Honegger pointed out, is the FBI acronym for their investigation of 9/11, and it stands for Pentagon Twin Towers Bombing Investigation. When I first heard that years ago, I thought, what a strange title, because the official narrative has no room for bombs at any of the locations. Is it possible that some members of the FBI actually thought that it was a bombing originally? And that's when we go to Jack Kelly's very interesting statement, which you heard yesterday, but I'll give it again. This is on 9/11 itself, when he reports live that the FBI's working theory at that point is that, quote, "At the same time 2 planes hit the building, there was a car or truck packed with explosives underneath the building, which exploded at the same time and brought both of them down." So that according to him, the FBI had an explosion theory. And when we look at the television footage from that day, we find it's not just the FBI. There were police officers talking about explosives in the building. There were firefighters talking about a theory of explosives in the building. It was all over the place. We begin with the famous clip from the Naudet brothers film, the 2 French filmmakers who were there on 9/11 and who interviewed people and so on. So this is from the day. The gentleman, the firefighter on the right is Dennis Tardio, and on the left is Pat Zoda. And let's listen to their description of what the North Tower, because we have to be specific here, what the North Tower looked like as it came down.
Nobody there. Where the fuck? What did we do? We made it outside. We made it about a block.
We made it at least 2 blocks, and we started running. Floor by floor, it started popping out.
It was like, it was if they had detonated.
Yeah,
as if they
detonated,
were planned
yeah.
to take down a building. Boom, 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 boom.
All the way down. I was watching it and running.
Just ran up west.
And then you just sort of this cloud of shit chasing you down.
Okay. Now, you know, it's worth pausing to think about what these guys are saying, because I have had so many people dismiss this kind of evidence that I'm dealing with, usually with a wave of the hand, an impatient gesture. Eyewitness evidence is notoriously unreliable was the first one. We dealt with that. The second one is, I don't care if a few people heard booms in the building. That could have been anything. It could have been anything. That is an extremely unscientific approach. It obviously couldn't have been anything. It had to be something quite specific, and our job is to figure out what that is. So, did these gentlemen talk about booms? Yes. Dennis Tardio uses the term boom, 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 boom. But there's nothing vague about them. Nor do they just hear. They see. They both saw the building coming down. They say it quite explicitly. It looked like. They affirm each other's testimony. And what did it look like? They convey this in part with these distinctive hand gestures, like little karate chops. This is what they both do. Dennis Tardio starts it off. the hand gestures. Pat Zoda agrees, does the same thing. Tardio then does it again. And this is what he said. I mean, this is what apparently this means. It means that there were a series of energetic and distinct events which began high and went down low rapidly and at regular intervals. There's nothing vague about that. That is extremely distinctive. And this is what they say. Zoda, floor by floor, it started popping out. Tardio, it was as if they had detonated, you know, as if they were planted to take down a building. Boom, 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 boom. Zoda, yeah. Nothing vague. This is rich testimony. It deserves to be pondered. Cannot be easily dismissed. Now, I want to take that hand gesture as a symbol of what it means to look for corroborating testimony. And that's why when we go on to our second rich case, we're now talking about quality testimony. I want to take Paul Lemos. This man was helping to do a commercial near the World Trade Center on 9/11. He was building a set. And his testimony is very specific and detailed. And he also gets very moved. If you watch the whole thing, he begins to cry. He was in the thick of things. And here is a brief clip from what he says.
Can you tell us your name?
My name's Paul Lemos. All of a sudden I looked up and about 20 stories below, at least that's what it looked like to me, about 75 flights up below the fire, I saw from the corner, boom, 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 boom. Just like 20 straight hits just went down, and then I just saw the whole building just went, and as the bombs were going, people just started running, and I sat there and watched a few of them explode, and then I just turned around, and I just started running for my life, because at that point, World Trade Center was coming right down, right above us.
This is very good eyewitness testimony. This, as far as I can tell, this footage is entirely independent from the Nade brothers film. That means this gentleman, Paul Lemos, did not see the firefighters, and they did not see him. And here they are independently on the day itself, and we know it's the day itself. We can see Building 7 in the background during Paul Lemos' testimony. The same gesture. Boom, 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 boom. Here's what he says. And by the way, this man doesn't guard himself. The firefighters don't go so far as to say they were explosions. They just say they looked like them. He doesn't guard himself. Here's his gestures. Here's his words. All of a sudden, I looked up, and about 20 stories below the fire, I saw from the corner, he's talking about the North Tower, the same building that the two firefighters were talking about. I saw from the corner, boom, 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 just like 20 straight hits, just went down. And then I just saw the whole building just went, phew. And as the bombs were going, people just started running. And I sat there and watched a few of them explode. And then I just turned around and I just started running for my life, because at that point the World Trade Center was coming right down. Very rich testimony. And I'm going to pause for a moment to say something else about it. If you watch the whole interview, he says at one point, he makes a remarkable statement at one point, that while he was there, after he watched the building come down, they, meaning the authorities presumably, pulled in an architect who came up to Mr. Lemos and told him that he had not perceived explosions. He had not perceived explosions. They told me they weren't explosions, he said. And then he talks about his interaction with the architect. The architect asks him, what did you see? And that's when he goes through the whole thing all over again. And the architect says to him, how fast were they? And he says, like firecrackers. Now, there's no evidence that Paul Lemos was ready to give up what he believed he thought he saw. But already on 9/11, on the scene, he's being told what he didn't perceive. Now, I'm not going to suggest that the architect was there for a sinister purpose, although I suspect he was. But this much at least we can say. There is no way at that point that anyone could have claimed to know scientifically that this man had not perceived explosions. hadn't studied the rubble, the physical residue, hadn't done a comprehensive study of video or still footage, hadn't done a comprehensive investigation of eyewitnesses. How on earth could he make that judgment? But there's more. He's interfering with a criminal investigation. I don't care whether you look at this as a homicide investigation or a fire investigation or a bombing investigation. In all three cases, it's clear that eyewitness testimony is important and that you go to the scene and you gather it. You don't tell eyewitnesses what they did and didn't perceive. He's interfering with the investigation. And one of the reasons this is so important is because as I read through the firefighters' oral histories, I could see that in the months, they were collected mainly from about October 2001 to January 2002, and that over those months, some of them are beginning to retreat from their statements. Well, maybe I didn't see that. And during that whole period, they are being bombarded, largely through the mass media, with the structural failure hypothesis. And more specifically, the so-called pancake theory, according to which the towers came down because of pancaking floors. Now, that theory was ultimately given up by NIST. So it's sad when you see these people doubting their own senses in favor of a hypothesis which is thoroughly discredited now. My witness list is not comprehensive, but I will be submitting to the Toronto hearings statements from 156 eyewitnesses. So this will be an appendix to my presentation. It's 35 pages long because it includes the actual words of each of these people. This eyewitness evidence has been ignored or suppressed by the 9/11 Commission and the National Institute of Standards and Technology. And I can be fairly brief here, because if we ask how many references there are to eyewitness statements about explosions in the towers in the 585 pages of the 9/11 Commission, we find that there is one sentence fragment. They are discussing firefighters who were in the North Tower when the South Tower came down, and this is what they say. Those firefighters not standing near windows facing south had no way of knowing that the South Tower had collapsed. Many surmised that a bomb had exploded. That's it, in 585 pages. This implies that eyewitnesses who thought there were explosions were in the North Tower at the time the South Tower came down. In fact, most of them weren't. It also implies that they made a mistake. And they made that mistake because they had an impeded view. They weren't near a window. They couldn't see what was going on. This is grotesquely misleading. Many eyewitnesses were looking directly at the towers. And I've already showed you examples. So whether it's deliberate or not, this is an extremely inadequate and misleading way of dealing with this important testimony. If we ask about the National Institute of Standards and Technology now, which was given the specific job of figuring out why these buildings collapsed, how many references are there to eyewitnesses to explosions in the towers in the 295 pages of the final report? 0. Not one. Now, you need to know that the 9/11 Commission and NIST had access to the same material that I have access to. It's not as if I have some mysterious sources here. And yet they both miss my 156 eyewitnesses to explosions, not to mention many other eyewitnesses that are not in my list. Whether that's deliberate suppression of evidence, which would be a crime, or whether it's simply massive incompetence, does not concern me today, because either way, we have an investigation that is thoroughly inadequate, and that's why we need a new one. And I want to end with one last guy, Gary Gates. I looked up and the building exploded. The whole top came off like a volcano. And, you know, Gary Gates could, of course, be wrong, but if you ask me if 156 are wrong, I'm going to say no, I don't think so. Thank you.
A 12th century Indian mathematician named Bhaskara put forward what has to be history's most concise proof of the Pythagorean theorem. He drew this diagram. It's a common tiling pattern. In this pattern, he could see a square built on the hypotenuse of a right triangle. But he could also see the same area in two squares built on the legs of the same right triangle. So a squared plus b squared equals c squared, and it's there. The truth of this statement is accessible to direct perception. His proof was a single word: behold. When I see Building 7 come down, my gut level response is simply to say, behold. If you watch it happen, there is really no question. It's a classic demolition. All support has been removed and the building falls straight down. We've seen it many times, always and only as a result of demolition. NIST wants us to discount our perceptions and our common sense and believe only them. However, we cannot overlook the fact that the NIST report was produced by a government agency in an administration that was notorious for censoring scientific reports for political purposes. The claim that an event resembling controlled demolition was caused by office fires is patently absurd. The analysis leading to this conclusion was based on computer models while discounting contradictory physical evidence. The computer model has not been made public. The report has not been peer-reviewed. Before NIST even began its study, the crime scene had been destroyed. NIST refused to search for residue of explosives. As our colleague Frank Legg has put it, quote, "The evidence for explosives in controlled demolition of all three buildings is both compelling and obvious. Hence, the failure of NIST to consider this possibility is prima facie evidence of corruption." This is a profile of the World Trade Center Building 7. It was a tall trapezoidal-shaped building. It's situated a little more than 100 meters north of the North Tower across Vesey Street. It's 47 stories or 174 meters or 571 feet tall. Its footprint is basically the size of an American football field. It has 58 perimeter columns and 25 core columns, and it was a massive building. The 23rd floor housed a specially reinforced bunker for the New York City Office of Emergency Management. The tenants of the building in 2001 included Solomon Smith Barney, the IRS Regional Counsel, the U.S. Secret Service, the DOD, CIA, New York City Office of Emergency Management, Security Exchange Commission, and several banks and insurance companies. Needless to say, it was a very security-minded place. On the morning of 9/11, WTC-7 was hit by debris from the collapse of the North Tower. Much is made of this. But whereas the Twin Towers were hit by Boeing 767s flying at over 500 miles an hour, the few large projectiles that hit WTC-7 were more like mid-sized trucks, and the fastest of them that I measured were traveling at about 78 miles per hour. That's highway speed. The planes that hit the Twin Towers had about 1,500 times the kinetic energy of the fastest moving debris that hit WTC-7. Ultimately, NIST discounted the debris damage as a factor in the collapse of the building, but many people in their common perception still think that's a major factor. There were fires on a limited number of floors that moved around the building, staying in any one place no more than 20 to 30 minutes, exhausting the fuel and moving on. NIST claims that the northeast corner of the 12th floor had intense, prolonged fires, which caused unprecedented thermal expansion in the beams overhead, pushing a girder off its seat. This failure, they claim, cascaded down several floors, leaving column 79 unsupported and causing it to buckle. The failure of this single column, they say, is what ultimately brought down the building. Throughout the day, there were sounds of explosions and reports that WTC-7 was going to come down.
Because we just heard one more explosion. That's about the fourth one we've heard.
You want to call your mother or something?
You gotta get back to here.
I didn't know it was the 7 World Trade Center, but I know it now coming back. A 4-block radius has been cordoned off because fire officials expect that building to collapse.
That kind of report was going on all afternoon. There's another one with Ashley Banfield, the previous woman here, also saying, see that building? That's the one I've been told numerous times is the one that's coming down next. So, BBC News famously jumped the gun and reported the collapse of WTC-7 in detail about 20 minutes prior to its actual occurrence. Other reporters who apparently knew the New York skyline better seemed to have had the same script but showed confusion when they were reading what they were reading did not match what they were seeing.
We are getting information now that one of the other buildings, Building 7 in the World Trade Center complex, is on fire and has either collapsed or is collapsing. And you, to be honest, can see these pictures a little bit more clearly than I. And clearly those fires continue to burn at about 4:15 Eastern Daylight Time.
So he identifies when he's saying these things, and it's 4:15. The building came down at 5:20. In my teaching, I use a video frame tracking program called Tracker as a data gathering tool. Here's an example of how it works. A student took a video of me dropping a soccer ball from a ladder. I imported the video into Tracker, then marked the position of the ball in each frame. Tracker captures the position and time data from which it can compute velocity and acceleration and graph anything versus anything else, basically. This is a graph of velocity versus time for that soccer ball as it's dropped. And notice that the slope, this basically is a linear graph when you take velocity versus time when there's a constant acceleration. So note here the slope is nearly constant at about 9.8 meters per second squared, and the number is shown right in here. It's 9.78 is what it's giving. But notice how linear it is. Notice how in the end it deviates from a straight line, because as the speed builds up, the drag increases, and so you're actually getting a little bit of a noticeable effect due to air resistance, even just from a ball dropping a few meters like that, okay? So air resistance, as subtle a force as it is detectable, okay? This is a graph for the roofline of WTC-7. Note that for well over 2 seconds, the graph is linear, so the acceleration, similar to the soccer ball, the acceleration is constant. The slope of the linear portion of the graph is essentially equal to the acceleration of gravity within the margin of error of the measurements. In other words, for this building, even though it is falling straight down through its own supporting structure, free fall actually happened. Notice also that there's a sharp onset of free fall. It just turns a corner up there. The building is holding steady, then it simply lets go. In the approximately 2.5 seconds of free fall, it falls over 100 feet, the equivalent of about 8 stories. Free fall is motion under the influence of gravity alone. All resistance must be removed. Some people argue that the resistance in the case of WTC-7 was not significant because the falling mass was so great. It's true the falling mass was great, but the strength of the supporting structure was even greater. The structure was built to support 3 to 5 times the actual load. Look again at the velocity versus time graph, and notice when it does eventually engage the structure, the rate of acceleration slows, then actually decelerates. And that's what you'd expect when you actually have engagement between the falling mass and the structure. As NIST is basically saying that the top part is crushing the structure, it should have been looking like that all along. The building has the strength to decelerate this falling mass. It's just that it wasn't happening. Newton's laws are formulated in terms of forces, masses, and accelerations. Another parallel set of concepts are the conservation laws. I'm teaching a little physics today. The conservation of energy, conservation of momentum, and conservation of angular momentum are primary ones there. To lift an object requires something we call work. And that amount of work is stored as potential energy as long as the height is maintained. When the object falls, the potential energy is converted to kinetic energy, the energy of motion during free fall. During free fall, all of the potential energy is converted into kinetic energy. But if any of the energy is used for other purposes along the way, such as crushing the concrete or deforming the steel or throwing things around, there will be less energy available to be transformed into kinetic energy. Okay? So I did a little simulation where I hope you noticed as it went through, as it had to do some work on something else, it slowed down the falling ball because some of that energy was getting siphoned off for other purposes. And you can measure the result as the kinetic energy of the falling ball is thereby reduced. In the case of WTC-7, all of the energy was transformed into kinetic energy. So therefore, the work needed to destroy the structure was not available. It had to come from some other source. The fact of free fall is literally proof of demolition. So the energy to do what the falling mass was supposedly doing could not have come from the falling mass. A mass in free fall can do no work. And if something was being destroyed, it's not being destroyed by the falling mass. It was destroyed to enable the mass to fall. The final draft of the NIST WTC-7 report for public comment was released in August 2008, and the final report was released in November 25th, 2008. In both of these, NIST discusses the rate of fall of the building. My measurement tracking the roofline is a completely standard way to understand its motion. NIST, however, did not initially do this. What NIST did was measure the overall time between two data points, like starting and stopping a stopwatch. The ending point was when the roofline reached the level of the 29th floor. Their starting point was 5.4 seconds earlier, presumably when the downward motion of the roofline began. This they compared with free fall time, which they calculated to be 3.9 seconds. They therefore proclaimed that the time of fall was 40% longer than free fall time. This is a stunningly invalid and meaningless measurement. Anyone at NIST who had anything to do with this measurement had to know immediately that they were part of a cover-up. The only way to validly compare the motion of the building to the acceleration of gravity is to measure the acceleration of the building. The acceleration is found from the slope of the velocity versus time graph. So in order to find the acceleration, you have to actually know the velocity as a function of time. In other words, you need a lot of data points. You can't get a valid measurement of acceleration from two data points unless you know ahead of time that the acceleration over that interval is uniform. Nobody does it this way because you can't assume a priori that the acceleration in a given situation is going to be uniform. NIST would not do it this way in a legitimate project. NIST desperately wanted to claim that free fall did not occur because they knew that actual free fall would be a smoking gun for demolition. So instead of a head-on comparison of the acceleration of the building to the acceleration of gravity, they focused on the completely meaningless notion of free fall time. That's not, I mean, that's a bizarre construct even, but you might not realize if it is. They said that the fall of the building took longer than free fall time, and to make even this work, they had to falsify their time measurement. Here's the 5.4 second interval they measured. I put a clock on the screen. There's the fall of the building. That's 5.4 seconds. Now, here it is, backward in slow motion. And see if you can tell when the clock should have started to be a fair timing of the fall. That's when they started the clock. Would you want these guys timing the race if you were a kid on a track team? So, to describe their timing as the time of fall is clearly dishonest. The building retained its full height for a significant period of time after they started their clock. The supposed event they chose to start their clock is a point in the middle of an ongoing period of disruption of the building's structure, but it was well before the actual downward motion. On August 26, 2008, NIST held a technical briefing conference, and I was able to ask a question. I cited the fact that a number of people had measured the motion of the building and had determined it was within a few percent of free fall. Yet the report claims it fell 40% slower than free fall. Then I asked, how can such a publicly visible, easily measurable quantity be set aside? Sunder's answer was that free fall happens when there is no structural resistance. Free fall would have taken 3.9 seconds, but their model showed it should have come down in 5.4 seconds. The 5.4 seconds of their model was reasonable because there was structural resistance. There was a series of failures that had to take place, and they were not all simultaneous. The question here was how the video evidence that free fall actually occurred can be set aside. Sunder's answer is that their model showed that free fall could not have occurred. That's his answer. Sunder is elevating their model above the direct evidence, and that is not science. Sunder's response typifies the entire investigation. What they did was they substituted a computer model, or several computer models, for the actual physical evidence. Taking the evidence out of the picture insulated them from having to go where the evidence leads, because they didn't like what they saw down that road. NIST's model is based on the assumption that WTC-7 came down as a natural collapse due to fire, gravity, and buckling columns. Since their model could not produce a free fall collapse, and since the video evidence shows that free fall actually occurred, their model is wrong, and the assumptions behind their model are wrong. NIST does not acknowledge this or try to account for the discrepancy in any way. If explosives were used, you will never discover them in a computer model. Even if the computer model can be made to collapse, it does not mean that's the way the building actually collapsed. Conclusions drawn from computer models can only reproduce what is implied by the assumptions that were programmed in. NIST could have made their model work if, at a mouse click, 8 floors of support in the model were suddenly removed. But that would require that the fall of Building 7 be interpreted as a demolition. NIST had no intention of going there. That would have involved culpability, and finding culpability was not part of their mandate. In the August draft of the public comment, the strategy was to cover up the fact of free fall. That strategy didn't work because we let them know that there were some of us out here who could actually measure these things for ourselves. In November, the final report changed strategies. This gets a bit complicated. First, they continued to assert that their earlier analysis was correct. You can find the same timing analysis in the final report as in the previous one. They added this more detailed analysis, and that's the way they described it. And so they did this from frame tracking measurements, the same as I did. Then they put their graph in a box, which they divided into 3 stages. The real fall of the building starts in stage 2 and continues in stage 3. However, they tack on the erroneous early measurements as stage 1. They put a smooth curve through the data, which has absolutely no physical significance, except to spin their results to look like a single smooth continuous process. The overall time for their 3 stages is, as you guessed it, 5.4 seconds. But they did one more thing. Amazingly, someone at NIST added a nice straight red regression line through their stage 2 data. They even gave the equation of the line. It shows that the slope is exactly equal to the acceleration of gravity. So that red line is a flat-out absolute admission of they're even closer to the acceleration of gravity than my measurement. They were right smack on the money. They're on that number for this accepted as acceleration of gravity in feet units, okay, 32. The red line on this graph means that NIST acknowledges WT7 came down without resistance and without doing any work for over 100 feet. It means all support for 8 stories was suddenly removed by something other than the falling mass. It literally means that NIST final report confirms WTC7 had to have been a demolition. The only thing that's relevant here is the slope of the graph. And the fact that the slope, it doesn't matter how it started, how gradually it started, or anything else. If the slope of that graph is the acceleration of gravity, it's in free fall. And it doesn't matter what it did to get into free fall. It's in free fall. So everything else they're saying here is irrelevant. Free fall happened, and NIST admits it. At least someone at NIST agrees with enough clout to put this into their final report and make it stick. NIST has no escape from free fall. The building as a whole entered free fall for a significant period of time over a significant distance. This requires the sudden removal of support, and that requires explosives. The NIST WTC7 report has never been peer-reviewed. There has been no forum for critiquing or correcting the final report. This does not constitute science. It is instead an authoritarian declaration by a government agency that demonstrated repeatedly its unwillingness to consider the one hypothesis that could actually account for their observations. The fact that NIST could not come up with an alternative model that actually works is a pretty clear indication that no alternative explanation exists.
So how did the Twin Towers fall? How did the Twin Towers fall? It sounds like a very easy question, but in fact it's kind of a tough question, because if you ask almost anybody on the street, if you had asked me 4 years ago, I would have said, oh, the planes hit and fires, and I think I heard some about explosions, but that didn't happen, and then they just fell down. But I really didn't understand how those towers fell. And I think if you ask the average person on the street that same question, they won't really clearly understand the official story of how those towers fell. But knowing how those towers fell is critical, because it's like if somebody was murdered, if they were murdered, that's one thing. If they died of natural causes, it's another. We need to understand how those towers fall before we can go find out who did it. September 12th, my local hometown paper carried a story from the the Washington Post. And in it, they already knew what happened. Pretty amazing. We have the 2 largest structural failures in history, and they already had it solved. They knew what caused it to come down. And we were told a different story. We were told the melting steel story. It says in just under an hour, a raging fire from burning aviation gasoline softened or perhaps melted the steel. The experts already knew. The experts agreed that collapse of the two towers after the attack was almost inevitable, as if obviously they're going to fall down. And they give little diagrams in there as far as how they came down. Newsweek extra edition. The intense fire caused the tower to collapse. It melted the structural steel. What the firemen might not have realized is that gushing jet fuel was melting the steel. As if firemen don't understand that steel frame structures, they routinely rush into them because they know they don't collapse. It's never happened before. But the Newsweek experts explained to us that the firemen probably didn't realize that. And indeed, there was ample evidence of melted steel. They were right about that. There's no question that there was melted steel. Here's some right here. And later you'll learn of other evidence of melted steel in very high temperatures. The problem came up that office fires and jet fuel cannot melt steel. It's a physical impossibility. They just cannot get hot enough to melt steel. And yet, we know there was steel that was melted. So that was a problem with our official story. Nova put together a very nice documentary that I remember watching. And it's interesting in their documentaries that they tend to use animations rather than the actual collapse itself. They don't focus on the collapse, they use animations. As you watch this, notice that they will show the trusses collapsing, and they'll show those trusses breaking away, but they don't show the concrete floor on top of it. The concrete floor is invisible. So we have an invisible floor and these independent trusses breaking down. Also notice in this clip that we'll have entire parallel floors going down, but they're basically floating floors in space. There's no corners on them, and they show this pancaking down. And so then we got into this pancake, what we call the truss failure theory for the official story.
The heat of the fire would have softened both the floor trusses and the outer columns they were attached to. When the steel became weak, the trusses would have collapsed. And without the trusses to keep them rigidly in place, the columns would have bent outward and then failed. Once the trusses fail, the floors they were holding cascade down with a force too great to be withstood. The result is what's called a progressive collapse, as each floor pancakes down onto the one below.
Now, what do we notice left standing? They forgot to keep going, and there's something left standing. This is a strong core, 47 columns. They weren't just freestanding spaghettis. They were all interlaced and tied together. It was, in essence, a freestanding structure. Now, along with experiments, hypotheses that are given ought to match or ought to explain the phenomenon which we observe. So what did we observe? Did we observe those floating pancake floors coming down? Did we observe any pancakes at all at ground zero? This is a collapse in New Zealand from the earthquake, unfortunately. And what do we have here? What do we see? We see pancakes. We see large chunks of floors. This was a 6 or 7 story building that came down. What did we see at ground zero? We had 110 floors. Did we see one complete floor? How about the roof? Did we see the roof? There was no load on top of the roof. We see nothing. We see cut steel, all cut up steel, but no 1 acre size floor. So again, we need to observe, and what do we use? We use our eyes to observe what actually happened versus the animations. Now, what about if we look at the actual collapse of the North Tower? Do we see entire floors coming down and hitting, or do we see partial floors? What do we actually see? This is just with a sound off, same speed, and I'm going to slow it down here. What do we see? We see them racing down one side. We see the corner still standing, coming down one side only. We don't see entire floors impacting. We see partial floors. What about this corner? Why is that still standing when this is rushed way ahead, dozens of floors ahead? Quite unusual. It doesn't match. It doesn't match what we were told. FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency, and the American Society of Civil Engineers, they went into ground zero, and they did a report, and it came out in, I believe, May of 2002. They studied it for 6 months, and they proposed a theory. It wasn't a pile driving theory. They proposed very similar to the PBS NOVA, the expanding floor truss failure theory. And that theory relies on there's heat in the buildings. Here's the core columns, and here's the perimeter columns. That heat expands the truss, it bows those trusses outward, and the trusses actually fail at the connection. So here's the columns, here's the trusses coming in there. Those trusses break. Okay, they break and they smash down, and then they kind of pancake down the rest of the way. That was their theory. It's in a published book. As far as that was what the official story was at that time. Well, then the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, came along, and they studied it from about September of 2002, I think all the way to about fall of 2005, and they came out with a totally different story. They said that they disagreed with the FEMA initiation sequence, what we call the initiation of how it started. They said that those floor trusses did not expand and pull, and the connections did not break. They said just the opposite of FEMA. So our official story is changing a little bit. They basically said that we know, obviously, airplanes hit the towers. We all agree on that. Knocked off the insulation. The jet fuel fire started. They said the fires weakened the floor truss, but the steel did not melt. The floor trusses sagged, but the connections did not fail. And that sagging pulled in, it didn't push out, those perimeter columns, and then once the upper section began to move downwards, global collapse ensued. So that's their story. That is the latest official story. But even after all that time, money, and expertise, NIST said that they were unable to provide a full explanation of the total collapse. Theories or models must describe what we observe. Confirmation of those theories by experimentation or testing is the cornerstone of the scientific method. The strongest arguments prove nothing so long as the conclusions are not verified by experiment. So will global collapse ensue once started, and is collapse really inevitable? That's what they're telling us. Let's look at some real-world examples of other buildings that were intentionally weakened. In this case, they were controlled demolitions. And they were weakened at the lower part of the structure, so it has even more mass to come down. Once they're weakened, will they automatically come down? This is called a zip feed grain elevator. It was weakened, it didn't go down. It is not inevitable once you start something. Notice that it decelerates, it does not accelerate, it decelerates. Here's another one. We're blowing up the lower section. Will it keep going? It decelerates, it slows down, it doesn't accelerate. It is not inevitable, necessarily. There's another one. What do we observe? It is not inevitable. It's falling over it, again, as Richard Gage would say, to its path of least resistance. So the statement that global collapse is inevitable, and all these experts are saying that, well, of course it's going to happen, is not backed up by our own observations. Okay, what about thermate? What about thermate? Can thermitic material cut or melt steel? First of all, what is thermate or thermite or thermitic material? I had never heard of thermite before 3 years ago, ever. Thermite is a mixture of iron oxide and aluminum. And when you add sulfur to it, they call it thermate. It's got that sulfur right in it. And so I decided to do a little research on thermite and to find out what it could or could not do. Now, one of the things that was found in the dust is that there were small iron microspheres found in the dust. These are very small spheres, and they're round. And the reason they're round is, the only way they could have gotten round is if they were molten at one time. And they have a lot of iron in it. So it's another evidence that we had temperatures higher or high enough to melt steel or iron. Of course, and we also saw molten metal flowing from Tower 2. There it is pouring down there. So there's evidence of high temperatures. It's about 7 minutes before the collapse of Tower 2. All of a sudden it starts pouring out. What is this stuff? Independent scientists started to piece all this evidence together. They had those iron microspheres. They had that molten steel metal coming down. They're trying to come up with what can explain that, because again, this is all after a collapse initiation. It was never explained to us. What could explain that evidence? And Stephen Jones, primarily, and others suggested that, thermite with sulfur in it, would explain that eutectic steel. It would explain those iron microspheres, and it would explain that metal coming down there. So the media picked up on this and sort of the hubbub about this whole idea of thermitic material or thermate. And they respond and say that, no, it couldn't have been thermite because it's not possible for thermite to melt a steel column. National Geographic used some New Mexico Tech, they conducted an experiment that proved that thermite could not melt a steel column. And since it wouldn't melt a steel column, obviously those crazy truthers must be wrong. And this is what they told us, and they demonstrated by experiment.
If thermite melts through this steel column, the theory of a thermite-controlled demolition may have some validity. While the truthers insist that more explosive super thermite could have been used in the tower demolitions, testing conventional thermite can illuminate this physical process and answer a simple question. Can thermite of any type burn through steel beams? Despite 175 pounds of thermite packed around the steel column, it remained undamaged.
Mythbusters says, the events of 9/11 will not be allowed to be debated and discussed. But they attempted to melt through the roof of a car with half a ton of thermite and couldn't do it. And the debunking websites say, the thermite would have also needed to cut sideways. Not an easy feat for thermite. You see, it's a powder which burns chaotically. Maybe with some device, but no working device has been proven to me to work to cut a vertical column. So we are led to believe that thermitic material cannot melt steel, cut steel horizontally or vertically, and would take massive amounts to do any real damage. I started thinking about this, and again, I'm no chemist. I don't know much about thermite. I'm no explosive expert either. I don't know anything about explosives, really. But I started to look into this whole idea about thermite and thermate and all these different derivatives of thermite. And you go on YouTube and you find out what thermite can do. And I realized that, well, of course thermite can melt steel. They show it melting a railroad track and welding it and things like that. So I started learning more and more. So I started to think that maybe I can do some sort of experiment. Let's see if they're right. Let's see if thermitic material can cut steel. They come out and they basically say it can't cut steel. Let's see if it can. So then I had to go about figuring out how I can do this. And I just started grabbing some things around the place. I found some steel beams, and I started kind of putting this thing together. And I put a little video out on the thing. Here's the initial setup of my experiment. Using the same beam from my eutectic steel video and another 12-inch beam, I proceeded to make a double-angle welded connection, which I set up on some 8-inch concrete slabs. I could not obtain nanothermite, so I made small quantities of old-fashioned thermate, which is not considered an explosive, with ingredients that are legal and readily available. Thermate is difficult to ignite. An ordinary fuse is not hot enough. But a magnesium strip, which burns white hot, will ignite the thermate, giving off heat and white smoke. In addition to giving off heat and white smoke, thermate produces lots of small spheres of iron. These iron spheres are a natural byproduct of thermate and not from any steel, just like those iron spheres found all through the dust. So that's the first thing I learned, is that thermate, those little round spheres, is a natural byproduct of that thermate. Okay, so then I thought, well, how am I going to melt steel? How am I going to hold it against any steel? If it melts steel, it's going to melt whatever I press against it. So I started thinking about fire brick, and I finally decided, well, maybe I will get some roof tile we have in Florida and cut it in half, put the loose thermite in there, wrap it around with some plastic wrap, and then I was thinking, well, how can I hold that against a steel beam? You can't bolt tile to a steel beam, so I decided to use some magnets and a spring tooth. And I thought, well, if I do this, I'll put 5 pounds on each side of this. Surely it'll melt that thing. It'll just take it right apart. Well, unfortunately in life, nature's not that way. Nature really doesn't care who you are. Nature's going to do what it's going to do, and it's going to prove what's true for that particular setup. So here's my first attempt. There's the clay tile. There's 5 pounds here and 5 pounds on the other side. There's some magnets and a spring tooth there. I went up to it and lit this thing, and I thought, well, here we go. I'm going to prove it. And I basically proved that it didn't do a thing, except for, I think it singed my eyebrows. I did prove that. So I learned that get a little bit further away next time I do that, because it gives off a pretty good heat there. So you do learn from everything in life with experiments. But, as they say, if first you don't succeed, I decided to keep on going. I had to scratch my head a while, and I thought, well, that's strange. It didn't do anything. It didn't do what I thought it would do. So I tried again. Now, when you play this video, I'm going to be talking over it, but as I burn through this column, I want you to, if you can catch it in time, you're going to notice some molten metal pouring down as I go through this. It's fast, but if you slow it down, and you can check it out on the video I gave you in the presentation there, it will create molten metal, and that molten metal looks very similar to what's coming out of the South Tower. But the steel did not melt, meaning that perhaps a container could be made out of steel after all. Using an ordinary steel box tube, I had a slot milled along one edge. Welding the bottom and using clamps on the top to hold the powdered thermate in, I bolted it to a steel beam vertically. I called this device my thermitic box cutter. With only 1.5 pounds of thermate, or less than 1/100th of what the National Geographic experts used for their experiment, not only was I able to melt steel, but it also sliced a vertical cut. So I made a slightly larger thermitic box cutter and used 2 3/8 bolts drilled and tapped on one side of the connection. Here's the molten steel coming out. You dripping out? It only took a slight twist to break it completely off. I noticed as the thermate burned, it tended to lose its cutting power, perhaps because it could expand into the area where the box cutter previously burned. So I built a piston-driven box cutter using a compressed car hatch piston. I added sheets of tungsten to minimize the burnout and allow the piston to slide better. I then bolted my contraption to the flange of the column and ignited the white-hot magnesium. It appears that not only can thermate melt steel, but it can also cut vertical columns. So that was my second test. And that one worked a little bit better. Now, in all those 10,000 pages of the NIST report, they do talk about pressure pulses and dust puffs prior to the collapse of those twin towers. A lot of little pulses coming out and a lot of dust puffs coming out, which I think is a very nice way to say that perhaps there were some pre-weakening explosions. But they called them pressure pulses and dust puffs. And so I thought, well, let's see what else we can do with this stuff. I wonder if we can emulate those pressure pulses and dust puffs through experimentation. Rather than using a mechanical piston to maintain volume, I segmented my box cutter with steel plates, hoping to get a more uniform burn, but got some unexpected results. Can thermate make pressure pulses and/or dust puffs? I guess it can. But why waste all that thermate and energy cutting the columns? Why not attack the weakest areas instead? Can thermate cut bolts? I guess it can. But what if just the head of the bolt is exposed rather than the nut and the threads? Can thermate be configured to cut just the bolt head? I guess it can. And without any evidence on the other side. I don't think that something like my piston-driven box cutter was bolted to the office walls, or trash bags full of thermite used. It's more likely that any pre-weakening thermitic material were hidden inside the perimeter box columns. I had a replica of a segment of the WTC box columns made up. And like the Trade Center iron workers, I bolted the segments together. It made 2 sets of my 2 bolt blasters, placing them in the access hole. Let's listen to another eyewitness.
Like, it sounded like gunfire. You know, bang, 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 bang. And then all of a sudden, 3 big explosions.
Is it even possible that thermate could do this? I guess it is. I made a 4-sided internal box cutter that was split into 2 pieces so they could be inserted inside the column. Let's see what happens. I think my box cutter blew about 50 feet up, consuming valuable energy and trimming my trees in the process. Nevertheless, the inside of the column was cut about 3/4 of the way through. Were thermitic devices or maybe explosive nanothermite sprayed inside those box columns? I'm not sure. And I'm not sure. I'm just saying what thermite can and cannot do. So again, remember the National Geographic experts and all the experts out there asked us this question.
Can thermite of any type burn through steel beams?
Using your power of observation, what do you think? Do you think it can, even though the experts said it could not be done? And again, I am certainly no explosive expert whatsoever. I just sort of fumbled through my way on this thing. I didn't know, I had no clue what I was doing, really. Unfortunately, there's another little quote out there. In these days, when a man who says a thing cannot be done is quite apt to be interrupted by some idiot doing it. Because we know that regardless of how beautiful their theory may appear, if it doesn't agree with experiment, it's wrong. It's wrong. So all the arguments from authority, as Carl Sagan once said, all arguments from authority are unacceptable, unless they can be backed up, I'll add, by experiment. Thank you.
Today, I'm going to present evidence related to the existence of unusually high temperatures at the World Trade Center, both during the destruction of the 3 buildings and afterward for several months. Much of the evidence presented here will be taken from 2 peer-reviewed scientific papers. One of these papers is called Extremely High Temperatures During the World Trade Center Destruction. The authors include 4 PhD physicists, 1 PhD chemist, and several others, including myself. The second of the 2 papers I'll discuss is called Environmental Anomalies at the World Trade Center, Evidence for Energetic Materials. I'd like to begin with the first of these papers and ask you to notice the maximum temperatures that were cited by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST, at the World Trade Center. NIST reported gas temperatures as high as 1,000 degrees Celsius within its report on the World Trade Center destruction. It's important to note that these are gas temperatures, not the temperatures of solid materials. But one problem with the maximum temperature cited by officials is that there are many eyewitnesses who claim that metal had been melted at the World Trade Center, and we know that could not have resulted from these temperatures. Here are just a few of the eyewitness statements that were made. The first one is from a man who worked for John Skilling, the design engineer of the World Trade Center towers. He said, as of 21 days after the attack, the fires were still burning and molten steel was still running. A chaplain at Ground Zero said, I talked to many contractors, and they said they actually saw molten metal trapped. Beams had just totally been melted because of the heat. Dr. Keith Eaton of the Institute of Structural Engineers said, I was shown slides of molten metal, which was still red hot weeks after the event. Another doctor from Johns Hopkins School of Public Health said in some pockets now being uncovered, they're finding molten steel.
You'd get down below and you'd see molten steel running down the channel rails. Like you're in a foundry.
Yeah, like lava.
Like it was lava
from a volcano.
But on the left here you see molten metal pouring from the South Tower and being pulled from the debris pile at Ground Zero, the World Trade Center site. NIST said that they found no evidence of molten metal. But NIST said if molten metal had been present, it would have had to have been aluminum from the plane. This was not the case, as one can see from these photographs. On the right, you see the difference between molten iron or steel, which is yellow-orange, and molten aluminum, which is silvery gray when poured in the daylight. The temperature required to melt steel is 1,538 degrees Celsius, and it's far above the maximum gas temperature cited in the official report. So the solid temperature, evidence for solid temperatures, are much higher than what officials say the gas temperatures were. In a structural fire, steel temperatures lag behind gas temperatures for a number of reasons, including the thermal conductivity of steel, the effects of convection, and the fireproofing that's applied. Achieving a steel temperature of 1,538 degrees Celsius at the World Trade Center would require gas temperatures that are well above 1,538 degrees Celsius and far above the maximum of 1,000 degrees Celsius cited in the official U.S. government World Trade Center reports. This and other indications demonstrate that the NIST reports do not address the evidence. I've seen evidence of the previously molten metal myself in the form of metallic microspheres that I've found in nearly all the nearly dozen World Trade Center dust samples that I've examined. Here are photomicrographs that I took of the first examples that I received in 2007. And we extract particles from the samples of World Trade Center dust. After realizing that such findings could be used in a legal proceeding at some point in the future, we began asking that samples collected by these independent sources be accompanied by documentation that recorded the date, time, and other necessary information, including sample location. Each sample was provided with this information, as well as the signature of the collector and sometimes a witness as well. The process evolved into the use of a standard chain of custody form, which I've used for many years myself as a laboratory manager. I've extracted the metallic microspheres and other paramagnetic particles from the dust in several ways. On the left here, you can see what the content of a typical World Trade Center dust sample looks like under a microscope. These photos are at 100x. On the right are photomicrographs of particles that were extracted with a magnet from the bulk of the same World Trade Center dust sample. At the top of that, you can see the many metallic-looking microspheres and other droplet-shaped metallic particles. Below that are examples of red chip-like materials and other metal-looking objects. If we look at the first of the two peer-reviewed scientific papers I mentioned, it begins with a discussion of these metallic microspheres, as well as the finding of semi-transparent silicate-rich microspheres. The paper addresses two independently collected samples that were received for this study. Both samples were collected indoors and shortly after September 11, 2001. One sample was collected on an indoor windowsill on September 14, 2001, just 3 days after the disaster, while search for survivors was going on, and in a building 4 blocks from ground zero. The other sample was acquired inside a 4th-floor apartment whose upper windows broke during the World Trade Center collapse a few days later. How were such microspheres formed? As with water falling or spraying through the air, molten metal forms spheres due to surface tension. When a liquid is falling or sprayed through the air, the molecules at the surface do not have other like molecules all around them, and consequently they cohere more strongly to each other, those directly associated on the surface. The United States Geological Survey found the same iron and silicate spheres throughout the World Trade Center dust and could not find an explanation. Our paper explains that the spheres indicate not only that the iron or silicate was molten at one point, but that due to the small size of the spheres, a violent disturbance of some kind would have been necessary to shatter the molten metal into the small sizes seen. Various explosive or incendiary processes are likely explanations. Our research team, led by Dr. Stephen Jones and Dr. Jeffrey Farrar at Brigham Young University, analyzed the metallic microspheres we found in World Trade Center dust by a technique called X-ray energy dispersive spectroscopy, or XEDS. This is a technique that provided the elemental composition of the spheres. In other words, it told us what elements the spheres were composed of. The result was that the spheres we found were very high in iron and low in other elements. This agreed with the findings of the R.J. Lee group. You can see the trace in the lower section on the left from R.J. Lee and how it matches with the trace on the right from our team. The temperatures required to explain this evidence, listed here, cannot be explained by the temperatures given in the official reports on the World Trade Center. To provide even more corroboration for these findings, we need only look to the official U.S. government report that preceded the current one published by NIST. The first report was from FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Administration. Appendix C of their report provided strong evidence of extremely high temperatures at the World Trade Center in the form of highly corroded and eroded steel samples saved from the buildings after they were destroyed. FEMA described samples of steel that had been thinned to razor sharpness. In some cases, there were inexplicable holes in the steel. The fire engineering professors who found the samples could not come up with an explanation for it. They also could not explain the sulfidation of the steel. That is, steel had been chemically changed at the microstructural level in ways that indicated a chemical eutectic mixture had been achieved between sulfur, iron, and oxygen, causing steel to melt. Other evidence for extremely high temperatures at the World Trade Center site include the finding of fused metal and concrete artifacts, like the meteorite, as it's called. This is a mass of molten steel and concrete found at the site, all fused into one big chunk. It also includes the thermal hotspots measured by NASA remote sensing instruments that measure temperature via electromagnetic radiation emitted from the surface. Surface temperatures in the debris piles were found to be as high as 750 degrees Celsius a week after 9/11. As you've heard already today, there's an explanation for all this officially unexplained evidence. This explanation is that the thermite reaction was present and occurring at the World Trade Center on 9/11 and afterward in the pile at the World Trade Center site. The thermite reaction is an extremely exothermic chemical reaction between aluminum powder and a metal oxide. The metal oxide is typically iron oxide, which you can see here on the left with a reddish color. The temperature at which thermite burns approaches 3,000 degrees Celsius for some mixtures, which would explain the evidence discussed so far in this testimony. The products of an aluminum iron oxide thermite mixture are molten iron and aluminum oxide, which quickly forms a white dust cloud as it cools. Additives like sulfur improve the burn properties of thermite. And again, a sulfur-containing thermite, which is called thermate, as Mr. Cole mentioned, would explain the evidence found by the FEMA investigators. I've made nanothermite myself via formulations published by the U.S. National Laboratories. On the left here, you see a photomicrograph I took of a particle extracted from the World Trade Center dust. On the right is a photomicrograph of a nanothermite material that I made. And below that's a photo of the ignition of that nanothermite. And I'd like to show you again a short video. But basically, nanothermite is a solution-made thermite. It's iron chloride dissolved in organic solvents. We add a propylene oxide scavenger material, which turns that into iron oxide. And then you can add organic compounds to this solution. And the important thing is that the organic compounds generate gas when the material is ignited. That does pressure volume work and makes it explosive, generates gas. Of course, aluminum is added as well. If we take just a couple grams of this nanothermite and put it in a smaller beaker on a hot plate and raise the hot plate to its maximum temperature, which is 550 degrees Celsius, this should cause the material to ignite. We'll add a loose lid to the beaker to demonstrate the pressure volume work effects that the expanding gas should produce. Even with this very small quantity, it should ignite and ignite rapidly and cause explosive gas effects that can be seen. Let's look at it again. As expected, we did see rapid ignition, less than a second to ignite at all, and rapid gas expansion. When we look, this is an important point, when we look at the ignition residues, they're strikingly similar to the appearance of the World Trade Center dust particles that were extracted with a magnet from the bag. Both are the same colors, they show the same metallic microspheres, and both exhibit the same kind of vesicular formations that suggest high temperature reactions or explosive effects. There was a huge dust cloud that arose from the destruction of the buildings. Again, you've heard about this. It was similar to that of a volcano. In other words, it was a pyroclastic-like cloud and appeared to be driven, therefore, by energy sources that exceeded the energy available from the gravitational collapse. Another striking fact is that the dust cloud was very hot and was burning people and setting objects on fire. Here are photos of the many vehicles that were set on fire or burned in the area. There were also many witnesses to the cloud being very hot and burning people as it passed by. Includes Thomas Spinard from the New York Fire Department said the dust cloud hit us, it got real hot, it felt like it was going to light up. Another man said a hot solid black wave of heat threw him down the block. Another said a hot billowing cloud of death chased us through the narrow streets of lower Manhattan. In conclusion, I think this is the evidence that needs to be considered. There are photographs and witness testimony of molten metal at the World Trade Center. This cannot be explained by the temperatures given by the official reports. There clearly were extremely high temperatures evidenced by metallic and other microspheres, evaporated metal, and silicates in the World Trade Center dust. FEMA reported findings of eroded steel and sulfidation, which have not been explained officially. NASA provided images of high surface temperatures, again not explained. Fires could not be put out at the World Trade Center site. There were unusual spikes in volatile organic chemical emissions, suggesting abrupt, violent fires on specific dates, and unusual species in the environmental monitoring data also corresponding to specific dates, suggesting the presence of thermitic materials. There were high temperature problems noted by the University of California Davis team, and there are similarities, again, throughout all of this to products of thermate and nanothermite. These vehicles were burned as if something passing through the cloud was setting them on fire, and there are many eyewitness testimonies to a hot wind and cloud. So thank you.
Today, in my presentation, we will zoom in on the dust, which we have all seen several times in the presentations preceding this one, and in such huge quantities in what was called pyroclastic clouds. And the pyroclastic cloud is a dust cloud which is hot. There was plenty of dust. And it influenced so many people in New York City, one of them being a woman who was living on the corner of Cedar Street and Liberty Street. It's this corner here. Her name was Janet McKinley, and she was allowed to come back to her apartment about a week later, and this is what it looked like. There was a thick layer of dust all over, and she had a cleaning job to do. She kept some of it for the purpose eventually of making it into a piece of art, because she also had an artistic mind. We put this dust into a plastic bag and apply a magnet onto it. I have taken actually a small sample out of this bag, put it into a smaller bag here, and I also brought a little magnet here. You should take the bag horizontally, or you can also put it vertically, and then apply the magnet to the dust, and you'll see something coming along. Play a little with it. The challenge for you is to isolate a black line of particles following the curvature of the magnet. The magnetic field is strongest at the edges. So try to pull out some magnetic material from the bulk and eventually isolate what probably will be a black line of small particles. And this is some of the stuff you can isolate from the dust by means of the magnet. It was first presented to the world in 2007 on December 15th in Boston by Stephen E. Jones. Following this publication of Stephen E. Jones, I was asked to join this team of scientists investigating these red-grade chips, and the work eventually ended up in a publication on April 3rd of 2009. The paper is based on 4 samples. Janet McKinley's sample is on the corner of the World Trade Center Square Plaza, and the other one here is from the Brooklyn Bridge. Sample number 3 and sample number 4 is a little north of that. In all 4 samples, we found these red-grade chips. These are the 4 samples, A, B, C, and D. When you heat these chips up, they react. What we're aiming at now is, you should know, we are talking about nanothermite. We're talking about the thermite reaction. You have seen this reaction scheme many times already. You've seen, and it was invented, it's an old, thermite is a very old thing. It was invented by Hans Goldschmidt, a German chemist, in 1893. It was patented in 1898 and applied for the first time in 1899 for welding of tram rails in Essen in Germany. Because in the thermite reaction, as you have already heard many times, you form elemental iron at a very high temperature. So it's very useful for welding. This picture also was shown by Kevin Ryan, and these are the various residues. These are chips which all have been into the DSC machine. We are taking them out, and we are observing these reaction products, the metal spheres. And these pictures, also shown by Kevin Ryan, is what the chips look like when Kevin is preparing the nanothermite in his backyard, and we see the same red chips here. So what else? So we believe that we have found what we call nanothermite. Let me repeat. You have a plastic matrix, and in it you have very finely dispersed aluminum and iron oxide, and that's it. An explosive must act by means of force. It is a chemical reaction where a gas is evolved and you knock things over like that with the pressure, with the force. And it has, in order to do that, it has to be very fast. The characteristic of explosives are not that they're energetic, but they're fast. They deliver their energy in forms of gas pressure very, very fast. But thermite and thermate acts by means of heat, contrast to explosives which acts by means of pressure. And relative, even though we saw Jonathan Cole demonstrating these wonderful experiments in his neighbor's garden, they are still slow on the time scale of explosives. Explosives are very, very fast. Some of the explosives, actually the combustion zones move more than 20 times the speed of sound. This is TNT, a very common explosive, trinitrotoluene. And this is RDX. It's called cyclotrimethylene trinitramine. And the reason why explosives are so fast is that the electrons only have a very short range to go. Both parts of the reaction are actually in the same molecule. So in TNT, the electrons only have to move from here and out to the nitrogen group. This is a distance less than 1/10 or 1/1000th of a meter. While in gunpowder, which is a mixture of powders, the electrons have to move from one particle to the other. Fireworks, rocket fuels, and old-time thermites. In nanotechnology, you start with composite materials, but you make the particles smaller and smaller and smaller. And this is what happens to a thermite reaction. As you make the particles smaller, the time of reaction gets shorter and shorter, and then of course you deliver the energy in a much shorter time, meaning that the effect gets much higher, and eventually you approach the delivery rate to that of molecular materials. The advantage of thermitic materials is that the energy content per volume is much, much higher than the unconventional materials, meaning that you can pack much more energy into a smaller volume than you can do with dynamite or TNT or RDX. Incendiaries which act by means of heat, they must by necessity be thermitic. And this is what we observed: molten iron in the rubble, molten iron coming out of the South Tower, and these iron spheres being formed, unambiguously indicating that thermite must have been there one way or the other. Now I will show you a video which David Chandler did not show. And I must admit that up until this point, I did not, as I said, indulge in hypothetical blast scenario. I wouldn't speculate where the red grade chips fit into any blast scenario. But upon watching this one, I changed my mind.
This is the destruction of the South Tower of the World Trade Center, viewed from a helicopter to the south. This particular video clip is rich in details that call the official story into question. Notice the numerous explosions on the west side of the building above the impact point. As the top 30-floor section falls, it tips to the east. It starts off intact, but then it disintegrates in mid-air. Gravity alone could not cause the top section to disintegrate. When an object is in free fall, there are no internal stresses. It should have hit the ground in one piece, but it didn't. Some of the debris is clearly being accelerated by forces other than gravity. These effects can be caused by late firing explosives, which can produce a white smoke trail. White smoke, consisting of aluminum oxide, is a byproduct of the thermite reaction. While producing this video, I ran across one rocket projectile I had not seen commented on before. This one stopped mid-air and changed directions. Even taking perspective effects into account, this projectile lost one component of momentum and gained another. That requires an impulse. Note that the rocket trail does not point back to the building, but the point where the impulse occurred. Let's take it from the top. There's a lot going on. Watch for the smoking guns.
This is outrageous. And when I saw this first time, I said, that could be our red grade ships. Look at these trails. And now, up until this point, I thought all the white dust coming out of the towers was crushed wallboard. There was plenty of wallboard, and it's white. But this is not what wallboard would look like if you crush it and throw it out the window. These are rocket trails. And this
byproduct of the thermite reaction. While producing this video, I ran across one rocket projectile I had not seen commented on before. This one stopped mid-air.
This is crazy. It goes out like this, and then it changes direction 90 degrees. And it still tracks a white smoke trail afterwards. What are we looking at here? This is rocket fuel. The number of responders has been discussed, what I've seen in a medical journal, and the estimate is between 60 to 70,000 of people were exposed to the dust for an extended period of time. And last year, there were published a paper in Experimental Health Perspectives by a group of doctors from the Mount Sinai Medical School in Manhattan. And they looked into the lung tissue on World Trade Center responders, and we should see what they found. The picture to the left here is from a lung tissue, and they found some thread-like tubular structures in 4 out of 7 patients which were ill, in numbers ranging from 11,000 to 230,000 per gram wet tissue. This is the same material which they found also in the World Trade Center dust, which is moving around here somewhere. Carbon nanotubes, what are they? Well, they are tubes made of carbon, but they are very, very, very small. They're very, very strong. They're hundreds of times stronger than spiderweb. Formation of carbon nanotubes requires 3 conditions must be fulfilled. You must have very high temperatures, and you must have a source of carbon atoms, which means an organic chemical present, and you must have a metal catalyst, among which iron happens to be one of the best besides cobalt. And so this triggered the thought in some of us, well, this means that ignition of the nanothermite should be ideal circumstances for formation of nanotubes. So this is the residue. Kevin, you remember he came in, he took the beaker and you saw down into it. Yes. He left it cooling a little bit, he put it into a letter and sent it to me. It is here. And what I did then is to take a little sample out of this, pouring a few milliliters of alcohol, ethanol, onto it, making a slush in a mortar, actually, letting the particles, all the metal particles, all the heavy particles precipitate. And then you take a little drop of the supernatant liquid, you put them onto a copper grid, which the panelists can also see here, they're very, very small. And you let the ethanol evaporate. You put them into a transmission electron microscope, and this is what you see. This is the perfect dimensions of carbon nanotubes. This is carbon nanotubes. I wouldn't come up with this if I didn't believe what I was saying. This is carbon nanotubes. This is a picture from the patients, the Mount Sinai study. This is what we find as a product of the nanothermite reaction. And please remember that none of the control group showed this feature. So if you ask, couldn't the nanotubes come from somewhere else? It's true, it is formed combustion of diesel and in much, much smaller amount and in oxygen-starved fires. But the control group have been living a normal life, except that they actually caught asbestos fibers. And none of them showed carbon nanotubes in their lungs. The goddess of justice, in my language we call her Justitia. And she is usually depicted, she's blindfolded, she carries a sword and a balance. And the implication of this obviously is that her judgment should not be biased by her own opinions. It should only be based on whatever the hard evidence presented in the case. So you could say that justice is blind and science is blind, but we are not dumb. Thank you.